Okay, I'm Dan Ellsberg. I had copied the Pentagon Papers in 1969 at the Rand Corporation and given them to Senator Fulbright of the Foreign Relations Committee, but he had not brought them out in hearings in '69. I left Rand with the FBI on my trail and went to Cambridge, MIT, Center for International Studies, in 1970, and attended actually the huge gathering in Washington over the Kent State killings and the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. In 1971, the war was still going on. Fulbright had told me he wasn't going to hold hearings after all, and I'd given the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in February, but I still wasn't at all sure they were going to go ahead with them. In the spring, a bunch of us, several from MIT, like Noam Chomsky and I, were meeting regularly to discuss what to do about the war. The invasion of Laos had now taken place, and veterans had thrown their medals over the wall. Later Senator, State Department Secretary John Kerry had given a stirring talk to the Foreign Relations Committee. Good guy in those days. And the war was getting larger, if anything, and I thought moving toward an even larger war. We were talking about what to do. It was an affinity group with Noam Chomsky, Fred Branfman, Howard Zinn, Mark Batashny of MIT, Mitch Goodman, the husband of Denise Levertov, Cindy Frederick, and Ganson, and Marilyn Young got together. And we heard there was going to be a demonstration in Washington on May Day, and we weren't sure whether we wanted to go. We heard there was going to be mobile tactics, whatever that meant, and we were a little worried. We didn't want to take part in a big event like the Chicago trial, let's say, or I should say the Days of Rage, the Weatherman. That was something we wanted to avoid. So were they going to be overturning barrels in the street and attacking police cars and whatnot? We sent somebody down actually to look into it. Meanwhile, I remember on a weekend I was speaking at a big rally against the war at Brandeis, and the place was packed. It was an amphitheater, and there were people in the aisles, and it was very jammed. And as usual, I was making it up as I went along. And I had just seen the movie Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman, in the course of which there's a theme. The Lakota Sioux keep saying, "Come, brothers, it's a good day to die." And as I reached the climax of my little talk, I asked how many people had seen that movie. They nearly all had. It had just come out. And I said, well, you know, they say, "Come, brothers, it's a good day to die." And really, it's never a good day to die. But May 1st is going to be a good day to get arrested in Washington, D.C. There was a huge uproar. Everybody leaped up and cheered madly. And I went home and told Patricia, well, I guess I'll be going to Washington, D.C. I couldn't back out at that point. So having gotten to Washington, I remember they were putting us up all over town. Maybe you were organizing that. And we were in somebody's house. Every bed, every couch was taken. People were lying on the floor. We were lying on the floor in a basement recreation room. And I remember we got up at 4:30 in the morning, and it was a very orangey, dim light. It was like the light in a troop quarters on a ship, which I'd spent a year in the Marine Corps, getting ready for an amphibious landing at 4 in the morning, a rehearsal, and people strapping on their backpacks and whatnot. And here were these young people filling water bottles and inking the names, the numbers of lawyers when they were arrested. And none of them had ever been arrested before, any more than I had. And it seemed to me the mood was, I was very impressed. It wasn't a slumber party sort of mood of high schoolers or something. These were, although they were young people, it was very serious, and I thought it was like the Marines getting ready to go over the side in nets, kind of apprehensive and excited and not knowing what was going to happen. We went out on the street, and right away a taxi cab stopped with a black woman driver who asked if we were going to the demonstration. And we said yes. She said, hop in, this is her second load. It turned out that all over town, taxi drivers, mostly black, and ordinary drivers were picking up people, young people, and taking them downtown to block the streets. We got to 14th Street. Incidentally, never having been arrested, I didn't know if I'd be allowed to take a book into jail with me. And and I took Revolution and Equilibrium by Barbara Deming, which was the book that had converted me really to nonviolent activism, by Barbara Deming. So it was a thrill when I got to 14th Street. The first person I saw on the walk there was Barbara Deming and Ben Spock talking together. I got them to sign my book. As a matter of fact, I got a lot of people that day to sign the cover of that book. It was a distinguished group. We, Noam and Howard and Marilyn and the rest of us, decided to get in the center of 14th Street, and cars would slow and go around us. Some cars would stop. And soon after we sat down in a little circle, two cops came toward us, and one of them, they were at right angles, and one of them put his big plastic helmet over his head and was raising his club. The other one had a can of mace. Or rather, he had a can of mace. And the other guy was coming at us with his club raised high at right angles. And just as they were converging on us, we all sort of thought at once, it's too early, we've just started here, let's move on. And so we sort of all got up and moved off just in time. And it was like Keystone Cops here exactly. The one with his, the mace can, shot the mace at the other policeman. We weren't there anymore, so the policeman was there to take it. And his helmet fell off, and he was scrambling. The other guy had his arm around him and was comforting him as we went off. And we spent the morning stopping traffic, more or less like that, never so dramatically again. Once we stopped a long line of cars coming out of an underpass, I remember. And at one point, a cop without a helmet, or a club actually, was herding us out of the street. And at that point, they weren't arresting anyone. They were just moving the traffic. So if you moved on, the police would concentrate on getting the traffic moved again, and they weren't arresting anybody. So I was walking along, and I heard Fred Brantman saying something to the cop behind us, and I turned around to see what he was saying. And as I turned, I had an extra Fred's, the cop, I remember his face very calmly shot mace in my face, directly in my face, instead of Fred's. And I was staggering back, and I couldn't see anything, and I couldn't think anything. This is what I'd heard mace did. I'd been tear gassed before. In fact, that morning we'd had tear gas, but never mace, and it was very disorienting. And actually, they tell me that I said right away, God, that was good mace, as if I were a connoisseur, but actually I meant, it does what it's advertised, it really works, you're out of it. Anyway, by the end of the morning, there was nobody in the streets to speak of. The cops had broken up the event. Unfortunately, there were, 25,000 people, perhaps 25,000. Not the 200,000 after the Kent, State, and Jackson killings that had flooded Washington. And had we then sat down in the streets, we would have stopped Washington. That was the year before. That was, I believe, actually one of the great missed opportunities of the war, just after Cambodia. And I well remember the Socialist Workers' Party people had volunteered to be monitors, and they didn't believe in civil disobedience. They thought workers don't like civil disobedience, which is perhaps true, but beside the point in a way. So I remember them picking people up out of the street and saying, we're not doing that today, and so forth. Big mistake. And the next year, the numbers had gone down. We couldn't actually stop it. But we did stop business as usual. The cars that were stopped, I'm sure a lot of them were probably irritated, but a number of them were flashing as peace signs. In fact, when I first arrived, I was over by the Washington Monument, and I saw Marines gathered together, and I went over to see who they were, and they were from my own old division, 2nd Marine Division. I was very upset to see them used for duty like this. But interestingly, a lot of them were holding their rifles in one hand and giving us a peace sign with the other. And many cars did the same, or honked, as we went by.
So
well,
you were arrested?
So we hadn't been arrested. We'd just been moved on and clubbed, I think, once or twice, but no arrests, and a lot of tear gas. So in the middle of the day, we called I.F. Stone and had lunch with him at a Chinese restaurant. And then we separated. Noam went off to a Texas Veterans Coffee Shop, that was organizing people on bases. And Howard Zinn stayed and did get arrested with 13,000 other people later that afternoon, most of whom had nothing to do with the event, which was over by that time. They were just tourists, or even a couple children of congressmen swept up in Georgetown. All you had to do to get arrested that day was have long hair, and or a beard, and if you're a man, and that did it. So 13,000 people put in RFK Stadium, including Howard, who simply asked the cop at one point who was beating someone, "Why are you doing that?" And he got arrested. I went off to New York to attend a meeting that I hadn't expected to be able to attend. I thought I'd be in jail, at the Council on Foreign Relations, to hear McGeorge Bundy. I'd worked under him, and earlier he'd been a dean of faculty at Harvard, and he was had been the assistant to Kennedy. He was giving a lecture at the Council on Foreign Relations on what was going to be a book about the war. It didn't come out. I had something to do with that, because he was talking to this entire set. All the ambassadors and former officials were there to hear McGeorge Bundy. And I felt it was like the dock at Nuremberg, practically. Here were all the war criminals in one room, including me, a minor war criminal. And heard him saying things like, there was no intent to deceive Congress with the Tonkin Gulf resolution. And I was thinking, by the way, I'd stopped at my wife's old bachelor apartment in New York to change clothes. I had a suit of clothes there, and I washed all the tear gas and mace out of my hair. My clothes were all saturated. Yeah. And changed clothes, went to the council, and heard him saying things like this. And I was thinking, oh, Mac, don't say things like that. This story is coming out very shortly, as it did, a month later, on June 13th. And it was a surreal experience to spend the morning stopping traffic with people in 14th Street in Washington, in the afternoon listen to McGeorge Bundy tell lies about the war.
Fabulous. So do you have any thoughts or advice for people who are protesting today? Any lessons learned from May Day that might be relevant?
Well, in wars, we're having wars now, a series of wars, into which we're being lied as egregiously as was ever true in Vietnam. And they're happening because there was no Ed Snowden, no Chelsea Manning at high levels to give the lie, as thousands could have in each of these cases. So there's a lesson for the need for whistleblowing, but in a broader way, the young people who had been filling water bottles with me that morning were on the right side. They saw clearly what was happening and that it was wrong. And they were using their bodies to put them in the way of the war, in the way of business as usual. There should have been something like a mass strike, for example, with the election by the Supreme Court of Bush over Kerry. The country should have shut down at that point. And likewise, there were, of course, big demonstrations at the time of the Iraq War that didn't seem to have any effect, and I think discouraged people from demonstrations. But had they been accompanied by civil disobedience, I think they could have been far more powerful. The moratorium of 1969, where people took a day off from work in what was amounted to a general strike in October 15th, actually had the effect of dissuading Nixon from carrying out his threats, secret threats, to use nuclear weapons against Vietnam in 1969. None of us knew that at the time. And very few people, have ever learned that they had that effect later, that Nixon had that intent of enlarging the war. Right now, for example, Marines are furtively being sent into combat in Iraq in a hopeless operation as before, essentially, as furtively as happened in Vietnam, where just gradually there's advisors and they're calling in air support. And as we talk, we may be weeks away from their being sent as units into combat in Iraq. I believe that is going to happen, all the more if there's a Republican president. But I think even Hillary is about as likely to do that as a Republican. So we need a change in this country. As Bernie Sanders called it, revolutionary. Well, it would be revolutionary. It would be as, we need a change as drastic as took place in the Soviet Union between 1899 and 1991. There has to be an entire change of priorities and questioning values and processes. Just things have to change. Now, amazingly, that did happen in a nonviolent way with the help of Gorbachev and a lot of nonviolent resistors. But we need nothing less than that, or what took place in South Africa with a nonviolent change to majority rule, which did not, in either case, bring about some paradise on earth by any means, or even marvelous government at all. And yet, it was a major change, and for the good. And it took place without violence. I think that's the way it has to happen, as in Spain, which became a democratic country, again, against people's expectations. So these positive miracles of nonviolent overthrow and resistance can occur. They're unlikely. It's unlikely here. It's not likely to happen, but it's possible. And on that, I think, rests in the present era of climate change and of continued nuclear doomsday machines existing. Human survival depends on changes as radical as that and as fast as that. And it has to take place, I think, without violence, but it won't take place without courage, people willing to commit themselves. And the spirit that I saw that morning in the young people on May Day is one of the most encouraging sights I've ever seen in my life. And I'm sure it's stayed with everybody. You know, we had I just inscribed a book to you, Judy, as a hero of the movement capitalized. I haven't written that I can remember in many years, talked about the movement. But you and I know at our age, there was a time there, it was almost a decade, when if you talked about a movement, everyone knew what you were talking about. There was, in the later stages of it, the women's movement, but earlier on, civil rights. And of course, against the war, anti-war, and organizing in the cities and so forth. So there were all these different dimensions, and yet everybody felt connected and had a feeling of hope, desperation often about the way things were at the time. As I say, Cambodia, Laos, it didn't look as though the war would ever end. And I didn't have any confidence that it could happen. I certainly didn't expect the Pentagon Papers to be very effective by themselves. And they weren't by themselves. It was Nixon's reaction to me and the exposure of it that did help get him out of office. That helped shorten the war. But I wouldn't have thought of doing the Pentagon Papers without the example of young men who were subject to the draft at that point, choosing nonviolent resistance and choosing to go to prison. It wouldn't have occurred to me, what can I do to help end this war now that I'm ready to go to jail? And what we saw on May Day was thousands of young people who were asking themselves, where can I best put my body now that I'm ready to go to jail to help end this war? And the war did end.